The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus says, "Whoever has come to know the world has discovered the body, and whoever has discovered the body of that one, the world is not worthy." Jesus says, "The one who has become wealthy should reign, and the one who has power should renounce it." Jesus says, "Whoever is near me is near the fire, and whoever is far from me is far from the Father's domain." Jesus says, "Images are visible to people, but the light within them is hidden in the image of the Father's light. He will be disclosed, but his image is hidden by his light." Jesus says, "When you see your likeness, you are happy. But when you see the images that came into being before you, that neither die nor become visible, how much will you have to bear?" Jesus says, "Adam came from great power and wealth, but he was not worthy of you. For had he been worthy, he would not have tasted death." Jesus says, "The foxes have their lairs, and the birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head and rest." Jesus says, "How miserable is the body that depends on a body, and how miserable is the soul that depends on these two." Jesus says, "The angels and the prophets will come to you and give you what belongs to you. You in turn give them what you have and say to yourselves, when will they come and take what belongs to them?" The Gospel of the Lord. How many of you remember the very first time you heard yourself on tape? Yeah? I remember well, it was 1958, and I was in high school, and the teacher brought in a tape recorder, and he taped every single one of us and then played it back to us one by one. And every time he taped somebody and played it back, so he taped Tommy, and he played it back to Tommy, and every one of us recognized, yeah, that was Tommy's voice, but Tommy was shocked. He could not believe that was Tommy. And then he tape recorded Johnny, and every one of us could see, yeah, that's Johnny's voice on the tape, absolutely. But Johnny couldn't believe that was Johnny's voice in the tape. And it came to me, and everybody could see, yeah, that's Sean's voice in the tape. I could not believe that was my voice in the tape. Because the thing about listening is that when we're listening to other people's voices, we're hearing the sounds from the outside in. It comes in through here, and we process it in the inner ear, and then we make sense of it. But when we're listening to our own voices, we're listening to our voice from the inside out. We're hearing our voices from inside the skull. And now when we hear it on a tape recorder, it's from outside and we can't recognize it. It sounds like a totally different person. But what was it like, not before tape recorders was invented, what was it like before mirrors were invented, before people had ever seen their own image? What was it like, do you think, to see your own image for the very first time? There's a great story in Irish mythology about that. And it goes as follows. A long, long, long time ago, there was a farmer in Ireland, in Blarney, just pretty much where Joan lives. And every Saturday he'd go into Cork to the marketplace, and he'd look around and he'd buy some stuff and bring it home. And one day he's in the marketplace, and he sees this little frame about this size, and he looks at it, and he's totally fascinated. He can't believe it, what he's seeing. He cannot believe it. So he buys it immediately, he puts it into his pocket, and on the way home, he's walking home, it's about 7 miles from Cork to Blarney. He takes this out every so often and looks at it, and he can't believe what he's seeing. So he comes home in here, and he doesn't tell the wife. He goes out into the yard every 5 minutes, takes it out of his pocket, looks around to make sure she's not looking, and looks at it, and he can't believe what he's seeing, and puts it back in. Of course, you can only hide stuff from your wife for about 5 minutes. So soon she's looking out the curtains, and she sees him going out, looking suspiciously around him, taking this out, looking at it, smiling, and putting it back into his pocket. So as soon as he went to bed and had his coat hanging over the end of the bed, she snuck down, took it downstairs, lit the lamp, pulled it out, and gave a shriek. So early next morning, she drags him out of bed down to the priest. And she says, Father, my husband is having an affair. And he says, what? My husband is having an affair. How do you know he's having an affair? I saw him looking at this picture of this hussy, and she's the most ugly looking bitch I've ever seen in my entire life. And the husband says, I'm not having an affair. I don't have a picture of a woman. That's the picture, show me. I went into the marketplace and I saw a portrait of my own father. I couldn't believe it. Who painted a portrait of my dad? And I took it home, but I didn't want to tell you because you and he don't get on well together, but I was fascinated. And the parish priest says, give me that, let me see. He took one look at it and he says, aren't you the two Amadons, the two simpletons? Sure, that's a picture of the parish priest who was in this parish before me. So that's what it was like when the first mirror was invented. And I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about what happens when you look into the mirror of life and you see yourself for the first time. I mean, you really see yourself for the first time. Because mainly we see our father, or we see the guy he's having an affair with, or we see the parish priest that was there before us. We don't really see who we are. So what really happens when you look into the mirror of life and you see yourself? So I want to make 4 main points this morning. The first one I will call good body, bad body. Second one I will call the shift in consciousness. Thirdly, a brief safari through evolutionary theory. And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about crossing into death. They're the 4 points I'll make today. So the first one is good body, bad body. There's a beautiful theory in Hinduism that says that human beings, as they reincarnate perennially, they come back again and again and again and again, they basically go through 4 great stages of growth. And they may take 500 or 600 lifetimes per stage. But the first stage of growth is that we're identified with our physicality and our sensuality. And so for many, many lifetimes, we're interested in survival issues. And we're interested about feeding our body and how we look and athletic prowess. And Hinduism says there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, we will teach you how to prepare really good food. Or if you're into sensuality, we'll give you the Kama Sutra. There's nothing wrong with these whatsoever. But at some stage, at some evolutionary stage, you'll realize there must be more to life than mere sensuality, than merely the gross body. So the second great phase, they say, is you come into a need for power and privilege and prestige. And you'll spend many, many lifetimes dealing with that. And again, Hinduism says there's absolutely nothing wrong with power or privilege or prestige if you know how to use them. But at some stage, after maybe 500 or 600 different incarnations being powerful or prestigious or famous or whatever, you begin to realize there must be something more to evolution and to life than just being powerful. And so you go into the third phase. And the third phase is service. The third stage is where you come to realize you have to have compassion for all living beings. And that might sound like it's the end of the road. But even service is predicated on the notion of separate identity. I can't be of service to somebody else unless I regard them as distinct or separate from myself. And so the fourth stage is what they call Sat Chit Ananda. It is being, self-knowledge, and total bliss. And that's the road. It takes many, many incarnations to get there. And so as they enunciate that, you find that religions pick up on this movement from body to body. And they'll do one of 2 things with it typically. We will invent 2 kinds of religion, basically. We'll invent what we call the ascending religions, or we'll invent what we call the descending religions. The ascending religions are the religions which want to practice asceticism and punish the body because somehow the soul is locked in the prison of the body and we have to free it by asceticism and ascend to the Father. The descending religions are kind of the earth-based religions that they celebrate life and they celebrate planet and they celebrate sensuality, but they're suspicious of the mind and they're suspicious of the higher reaches. So we develop these 2 kinds of religions. So there's this tug of war going on constantly in religion and in people who are taking their journey seriously. So the Buddha was such a person. The Buddha, of course, was born as a Hindu. He was a prince of the realm. And the Buddha was trained in the first 2 stages very, very well. He was trained into sensuality and he was trained into power. He was a prince of the realm. And he was protected from all influences which would take him away from that. But at age 29, on a night safari, for the first time in his life, he saw an old person. He'd been shielded from age. Nobody more than 40 was allowed near him. And for the first time ever, he sees an old man. And he says to his companion, "What's that?" And his companion says, "That's an old person." He says, "What do you mean an old person? Every one of us gets to look like that eventually." He says, "You mean I'm going to look like that?" He was really upset. So the second night he goes out with his friend and he meets somebody who's dying, really, really, really sick, dying. And he says, "Who's that?" He said, "That's somebody who's dying. He's really sick. He won't recover." And the Buddha says, "Am I going to wind up like that?" And his friend said, "Of course, you're mortal." And this really upset him. And then the third safari, he goes out and he sees a body being brought to the ghats. The ghats is where they burn, they cremate the bodies. And he says, "What is that?" He says, "That's a dead body. It's been taken out to be cremated." And this really freaked him out. So he goes back to his palace, goes into his wife's bedroom, kisses her while she's asleep. He has a 1-year-old son, kisses the son goodnight, and goes off into the forest. And for the next 6 years, he's trying to practice asceticism. So he's gone from hedonism to asceticism. Hedonism, he realizes, is not going to work. That kind of lifestyle is not going to bring ultimate happiness. So now he's going to practice ultimate asceticism. So he attaches himself to a group of sannyasin, forest dwellers. And he lives with them for 6 years, and he's practicing ultimate asceticism. Finally, he's living on a single grain of rice a day. But at the end of 6 years, he doesn't feel any nearer the truth. And so he develops his own system, which is called the middle way. It's the realization that it's not hedonism and it's not asceticism. There is a way to enlightenment which straddles both of these and finds a middle path. That was his great, great insight. 550 years after the Buddha came John the Baptist. And when you put Jesus and John the Baptist together, in some senses, you get the recapitulation of the entire life of the Buddha. John had totally eschewed the body. He had punished himself living just on locusts and wild honey and wearing really, really rough garments. So he totally eschewed hedonism, although he too, like the Buddha, had been born into privilege and power. His father was a priest in the temple. He eschewed that and went totally into asceticism. Jesus would follow more the Buddhist path, the realization of a middle way. Jesus would heal bodies, and he would feed bodies, and he would feed the mind through his teaching. And he would be regarded and called a glutton and a drunkard. Because Jesus realized that the body is a gift, but it is not our identity. There's a place beyond the body. And that's what he's talking about in the readings today. So again, Jesus is trying to bring us into balance, into the realization that everything we experience and every level of self that we experience is a gift from God. We have to experience them, honor them, celebrate them, but not get identified with them. That's the trick that Jesus understood, and that John the Baptist didn't understand. And so when we've been reading the Gnostic material now for about a year and a half, Gnosticism is accused of being really ascetical. And indeed there were Gnostic streams of Gnosticism which regarded the body as a prison in which the soul is trapped, and in order to free the soul, you have to punish the body. But when you really understand Gnosticism properly, it's not saying this at all, because how it's using the word body is very, very, very different. So that's the first notion, the notion of good body, bad body. My second point is this then. There's the transition and the shift in consciousness. The first two levels that Hinduism speaks of, they're kind of allied to the chakra system. If you know the chakra system in Hinduism, where we have 7 transforming stations in the physical body that step down cosmic energy into our physicality. And the first one is located at the base of the spine, and it's the energy of survival. It's literally what we need to do in order to survive in these spacesuits of ours. We need to eat, we need to drink, we need to breathe. So there are things this spacesuit needs for its survival, and they're located in the base chakra. The second chakra is about genitalia and generativity and co-creating with God, and it's about sensuality in all its forms. And again, it's really, really good if it's used properly, but it's not the end of the journey. And so the first stage in Hinduism is allied to these first 2 chakras. It's about chakra 1 and chakra 2. And people who are addicted or who are stuck at this stage, they're difficult people to be in relationship with because they tend to be very narcissistic and self-engrossed, but they're not that dangerous. They don't do a whole lot of damage except to themselves and to those who are attempting to be in relationship with them because they're very, very self-engrossed. When people have moved to the third stage, the third chakra is about 2 or 3 inches below the belly button. It's called the hara, and it's the place of personal power. When people get into that, then they're really dangerous if they're not using that properly. because people who are stuck in 1 and 2, they're only a danger to themselves and their relationships. Somebody who is stuck in number 3 is a tribal, a national, and now an international danger. Because somebody who is stuck in number 3 is a megalomaniac, and they seek power for power's sake. Power, properly understood, is the ability to be an independently functioning member in a relationship. Power, misunderstood, is to have dominion over other people's lives. And we've reached a stage in world history where there are people who have enough power to dominate the global agenda. That's what happens when we get stuck at stage 3. So the shift in consciousness is a shift from 1st, 2nd, 3rd chakra to 4th and 5th. The 4th is the heart chakra, and obviously it is about compassion and it is about love. And the 5th chakra is about wisdom, real wisdom. In other words, tapping in to the wisdom of God herself. And that is the invitation that's been extended to us as individuals and as a global community. In fact, I would go and say that enlightenment is never an individual journey. Enlightenment is not about personal salvation. Enlightenment is not about getting to heaven. It's not getting up there, being assigned a harp or a flute or whatever you're interested in, and then wiping your brow and say, I'm glad I'm here, that I missed going down. Salvation is not about that. Salvation is about a global shift in consciousness until all sentient beings reach the freedom of nirvana. So an individual, in my opinion, cannot be saved on their own. Anybody who is looking for individual salvation and who thinks that heaven is a place of a reward for people who lived good lives and now get ringside seats to look down at the suffering of the damned, they don't understand salvation and they don't understand enlightenment. Our times and our agenda as individuals, as communities, as nations, and as a world community is to shift the very consciousness of the globe itself. It is to move it from 3rd level thinking to 4th level thinking and to 5th level thinking. And we're on the verge of this. The avatars have been coming among us for 2,500 years. They are the prototypes of that shift in consciousness. And it's a race to the finishing line between ecological degradation and nuclear holocaust on the one hand, and the breakthrough into Homo spiritualis on the other hand. And that's why we're here. That's why we volunteered for mission on planet Earth at this stage, is to create the kind of critical mass that will allow the next phase of the human evolution to come through. Which brings me to my 3rd point. I'm going to do a very, very brief run through the last 400 or 500 years of evolutionary theory. Darwin is credited with the notion of evolution. Darwin himself acknowledged that it goes back much, much further than he. In fact, he quotes Aristotle as being the first person to talk about the notion of evolution. So it's not just belong to Darwin. But fast forward to 1620 to an extraordinary German mystic called Jakob Boehme. In 1620, he was writing in his mystical writings that the entire trajectory of human history is an ascent toward perfection. Some years later, another German, a great scientist in his own right called Gottfried Leibniz, who was the inventor of calculus together with Newton, Leibniz, in a book he wrote in 1691 called Proto-Gaia, he was the first one to mention, he said, in the huge sweep of history, of the history of our planet, even the animal forms themselves have morphed and transformed on many different occasions. So literally he's the first one to begin speaking about species morphing or species transformation in 1691. Very, very quickly, we move into what is grandiosely called the Age of Enlightenment, basically the 1700s. And the Age of Enlightenment was a reaction to the church at the time, to the terrible corruption of the church and the domination of the church, and particularly the church's suppression of the curiosity of the scientists. And it culminates, of course, in 1789 with the French Revolution. But the whole 1700s are devoted to the notion of the Age of Enlightenment. And now these will pursue Leibniz's idea of the transformation and the morphing of species, but they will divorce science from spirituality, and they will divorce reason from religion, and it will become an extraordinarily materialistic endeavor. So now evolution has gone off on a sidetrack. Instead of being a spiritual, physiological thing, it is now purely materialistic. And in fact, most evolutionists are still stuck in that track. When you talk about evolution, for most people, it is still a scientific endeavor, totally devoid of spirituality. It's about reason devoid from religion itself. But that was very strong for 100 years. And then in 1799, and it seemed like the action was happening in Germany, an extraordinary wunderkind, at the age of 24, a guy called Friedrich Schelling, started a group, a kind of a discussion group, and his mentor was Goethe. And he created what was called evolutionary idealism. And his notion was that the basic stuff of reality is not matter. The basic stuff of reality is consciousness. And this absolute consciousness, it breaks into time and space by creating more and more complex life forms, starting with just matter, which is studied by physics, and then throwing up life, which is studied by biology, and then throwing up mind, which is studied by psychology, and it continues. And he would claim that history is the record of that evolution of spirit, and I totally agree with him. History is not a record of all of the battles and the concordats that human beings have visited upon each other. These are little footnotes. These are little diversionary excursions. History is primarily about spirits moving through planets and throwing up more and more evolved species until finally a species arrives that recognizes both its own divinity and the divinity of all else that is. And so Schelling would say that this is what history is about. This is the trajectory of history. You move up to another extraordinary Indian saint called Sri Aurobindo, who died just in 1950. And Sri Aurobindo would take the theory of evolution and he would create a practice in order to hasten it and accelerate it. And he called this integral yoga. There were literally practices that he believed would change the genetic structure, literally our DNA, and bring the evolutionary process forward. And he claimed that there were many stages of evolution after mind. Now he used the word mind to talk about these ones. He talked about the overmind, which is beyond rational mind. And then he talked about the integral mind, which is beyond overmind. And then he talked about intuitive mind, which is higher still. And then he talked about super mind. So he's literally talking about a superhuman being that would physiologically, mentally, and spiritually evolve in our times, or maybe a little bit later. Slightly after this, in France, you have two great mystics, scientist mystics, Henri Bergson and Teilhard de Chardin, both looking at the evidence for biological evolution, but wedding it to a spirituality. They're trying to rejoin the streams that had been severed with the Age of Enlightenment, bring back spirituality and biological evolution. And so Teilhard de Chardin would say stuff like, in the beginning of this cosmic expansion and this cosmic evolution, atoms join together into super huge molecules in order to move the process of life forward. So from tiny little atoms, clusters of atoms create molecules. And he said the same thing happens with cells. Single cell creatures like bacteria, they join together into multicellular creatures and you get more and more complex life forms. And Teilhard de Chardin was of the opinion that there's a confluence going on between the evolution of matter and the evolution of consciousness, and they will meet at a point he called the omega point. And so literally, when you look at evolution, it is not just about biological species, you're developing opposable thumbs. It is about a shift in consciousness. And the shift in consciousness which will take us from a belief system that it's about power to the realization it's about love and it's about wisdom. Which brings me to my fourth point. I call it crossing over death. So if you were listening to the readings today, the two words that keep repeating throughout the three readings are the word cross and the word death. But of course, they're used in very, very different senses. So I've said this to you many, many times. When Jesus says in today's readings and elsewhere, there is no salvation except in the cross, what is he talking about? Does he mean this piece of wood, this instrument of torture on which he died? Not at all. I don't believe it for a moment. The cross for me is not an implement of torture, and it is not an invitation to eschew the world and our physicality. It is neither of those things. It is the realization that the vertical arm of the cross is the connection between all the dimensions of our being. It's the connection between our physical body and our etheric body, between the etheric body and the astral body, between the astral body and the mental body, between the mental body and the causal body, between the causal body and Atman, and between Atman and Brahma itself. So the vertical arm is the connection that joins all worlds, all dimensions, and all levels together seamlessly. And the horizontal arm of the cross is the connectivity and the relationships that you find at any one of these levels, whichever level you choose to concentrate on, and you extend your arms, there are your brothers and sisters, other kinds, other species inhabiting this very same dimension. And the place they intersect, that is yourself. Now, there are two ways of operating in the world. The first way to operate in the world is to start with a notion of myself, and then put myself in relationship to other selves, and then we create connections. That's one way of doing it. It's the way we've been doing it most of human history, and it doesn't work. There is another way of doing it, and it is to start with relationships, a web of relationships, and then realize I am the intersection point of this web of relationships. And what happens when we do this, we get an ecological spirituality. The reason that we have dominated nature and despoiled nature and raped nature is because we've started with the notion of the human species as a separate, ontologically discrete entity, which then goes into relationship with nature, and it's a relationship of domination. When we start with the web, the interlocking network of relationships, and we find our place in that web, we have a totally different relationship to nature. About the same time as the Buddha, there was another extraordinary avatar in China, a man called Confucius. We know him as Confucius. And Confucius claimed, like the Buddha, that there was no separate self. He said the self is an illusion created by the sum of our social roles. Let me just tease that apart for you. The self is an illusion created by the sum of our social roles. Confucius taught that there are 5 permanent relationships. He called them 5 permanent relationships that everybody will find themselves in. The first relationship is the relationship between parents and child. The second relationship is the relationship between husband and wife. The third relationship is the relationship between elder brother and younger sibling. The fourth relationship is between the teacher and the student. And the fifth relationship is between the emperor and the subjects. And Confucius was of the opinion that it is by fulfilling these 5 relationships we discover who we are. I'm saying the same thing with the cross. I'm saying that it is only by understanding the vertical dimension, the vertical arm that connects the dimensions, and the horizontal arm that connects all of the species at any one dimension, at the intersection point is the I. You can only discover who you are by the relationship between the vertical and the horizontal. Confucius was saying the same thing with 5 separate relationships. So the image I use sometimes to explain this is the following. Imagine you had a frame in which there had been a picture, frame about this size, but there's no back, there's nothing in it. It's just the frame, the empty frame. There's no back or front to it. And you have it stuck in a corner. And a spider comes along and he spins a web in it. And you look at the web, and it's a beautifully designed web. It's pretty much concentric circles, except spiders don't actually make concentric circles. They make concentric polygons. They're not quite circular, they're polygons. But they're concentric, one within the other. And it's connected to the frame by spokes. And I come over and I look at it and I say, Grace-Ann, can you tell me where the center of the spider's web is? And you look at the innermost polygon and you point to the middle of it and you say, that's the center of the spider's web. I say, okay. And I pick up the frame and I take it over and I put it up on the table. And I say to you, can you tell me where the center of the spider web is now? And you go across and you say, yeah. It's right in the middle of the smallest concentric polygon. And I take it out in the deck, and I put it in the deck, and I say, can you tell me where the center of the spider's web is now? And you come out and you point to the same place and say, that's it. Now, the physical location has changed 3 times. So is the center of the spider's web a location? What happens if I start stripping off the concentric polygons one by one, and then the spokes, until finally I disassembled the web, and I say to you, can you tell me where the center of the spider's web is? And the center of the spider's web now is gone. It's changed physical location 3 times. Now it's gone completely. Because there was an illusion created by the sum of the parts. That's what Confucius was saying. And that's what I'm saying this morning. That in a sense, the sense of separate self is an illusion. Not that it's made up, but that it's identified and it's activated only when we're in relationships. And that for me is what the cross is about. It's about having the ability at every dimension to send out horizontal arms of relationship to all the beings and all the species who inhabit that dimension. Whether it's the physical dimension, the etheric dimension, the astral dimension, whatever dimension it is, that we have the ability as we climb through the ladder of self-identification to relate to all of the species there, and that's how we find the self. That's my understanding of cross. And finally, my understanding of death. The word death is used in these readings several times today and used in very contradictory forms. If you look at what James says about it in his secret book of James and what Silvanus says about it in the second reading, they're totally opposite. James says, be seekers after death. If you're serious about the spiritual life, be seekers after death. Silvanus in the very next reading says, cast off death. Death is the problem. So who do we believe? The problem is they're both using the notion of death in very different ways. And neither of them is using the word death to mean our physical demise. It's not about the demise of the spacesuit. Neither of them are speaking of it in this fashion. They're using it metaphorically in different ways. So what does it mean? Either to seek out death or to go beyond death. What's the death of which we're speaking? The death is the identification with just a particular level of reality and the feeling that there is nothing beyond it. And going beyond that, seeking death then, is the ability to let go of this illusion that we're only our physical bodies, or we're only our ideas, and the ability to inhabit all of these dimensions and hold them all together with the vertical arm of the cross. There's a beautiful notion of the astral body, according to esoteric theory. When you sleep at night and you dream, you inhabit your astral body and you go off on great trips and you encounter all kinds of beings. According to the esoteric literature, there are two levels to the astral plane in which you're traveling. The higher astral plane is the place where you're going to encounter beings of light, angelic beings, superior intelligences, and from these places you will get information and wisdom and you will download great ideas. But there's a second level to the astral plane. It's called the lower astral plane, and it's a place inhabited by the discombobulated dead. People who have died physically but are not aware of the fact that they have died physically. And they're trying to reconnect with physical beings. They're coming to a room and everybody seems to be ignoring them and they're really upset. They don't realize they're dead. They're locked in this space. And Christ says in the reading, through Thomas's reading today, you must be seekers after death like the dead who are seeking for life. Who are the dead who are seeking for life? They're the discombobulated entities who have transitioned but don't know they've gone, and they're trying to get back into their spacesuits, and Christ is saying, no, you're looking in the wrong direction. You mustn't be looking back down, you're looking up towards the light. That is what the transition into death. And they're mediated because it is the cross that brings us into that realization. It is dying, and we get many, many opportunities to die every day. It's not about the demise of the spacesuit. It's about the disidentification with every level of self until we come finally to the knowledge and to the wisdom that there is only God playing a game in which she pretends she's not God.